again, welcome back to Bert's Books, where this time we are going to be looking at John Pidgeon's Slade In Flame.
Everywhere has a wheeler and dealer racing the back streets of town. Everywhere has a spieler who's a clown.
By 1974, Slade were arguably the biggest pop act in Britain. They'd notched up 6 UK number ones and were selling out gigs at the level of Earl's Court, which was 20,000 seats. It seemed that not even a life-threatening car accident for Slade's drummer Don Powell was able to stop their career in its tracks. So riding this high, and short of that all-important career step of breaking the United States market, there didn't seem to be any conceivable way that Slade could become any bigger in the market they'd already conquered. What else was there for them to do but to make a feature film? The process is described in Chris Charlesworth's 1984 biography of Slade, Feel the Noise. From Japan, Slade flew to America, and on their 5th US tour they were accompanied by Andrew Birkin and Richard Loncraine, 2 filmmakers commissioned by Chas Chandler to produce a screenplay for their next project, a fictitious but curiously autobiographical film about the life of a rock band. The original script that Birkin produced was modified considerably by the band themselves. It was pretty ropey when we first read it, just not the things that groups would say to one another, says Noddy. We had a lot of say in it and we virtually rewrote it. The storyline all came from stories that we told Andrew Birkin, and it was good. Further rewriting was done by Chandler and Johnny Steele, both of whom were keen to inject the movie with a sense of realism not often found in pop films. In this respect they succeeded admirably, perhaps too much so. I was proud of it, says Holder, but I don't think it was what the public expected. They probably expected a much more jolly slapstick comedy film, and it certainly wasn't like that at all. Slade In Flame was a refreshingly candid look at the career of a rock group, Flame, and their rocky ride to the top. Each member of Slade played their opposite number in the fictitious group, and Alan Lake had a major role as the singer that they ditched along the way. The original version would have earned an X certificate, mainly for the bad language. Rock journalist John Pidgeon was commissioned to write the paperback of the film, which was published by Panther Books to coincide with the film's release. The paperback book of Slade In Flame, written by journalist John Pidgeon, was published in 1974. We sold around 150,000, and that is pretty good sales for any book, says Nick Webb, then the editorial executive of Panther, who published the paperback. Like the uncut version of the film, the book was liberally sprinkled with bad language, and this became another controversial topic for Slade. The book comes, as any decent film tie-in should, with a centre section featuring stills from the film. Our story opens to the kind of setting which no rock musician's dreams are ever made of. A scene in which embittered hack vocalist Jack Daniels is leading his band, the DTs, through a dispiriting and indifferent wedding gig performance at some indeterminate point in the mid-60s. It's evident from the leer on guitarist Barry, i.e. Dave Hill's face, that he's put some ale away that afternoon. During a bash through Shaking All Over, Barry lecherously employs his guitar stock as a hoist for the bride's skirts. This highly inappropriate prank precipitating an all-out drunken fist fight in which drummer Reg's kit is demolished, the end result being that the band are given their marching orders. Jack Daniels' immediate reaction is, pragmatically, if rather ruthlessly, to give Barry a final warning about drinking on the job and to audition for a new drummer. It's evident from this process that the other members of the DTs do not regard the job as any great privilege, and that they have Jack categorised as a washed-up Elvis wannabe. Jack, however, insists he can recognise class when he sees it, and hands the job, without even hearing him play, to Charlie, i.e. Don Powell, who Daniels, keen to redress the power base in the band in his own favour, goes to some lengths to try and impress. Later that week, Jack introduces Charlie to his manager, the skinflint Harding, who quizzes Jack on Charlie's abilities. Jack, of course, has to wing it on that one, but the first rehearsal with their new drummer proves that Jack's judgment has been correct, although the drummer does put his foot in it when he asks whether the band do any original material, evidently something of a sore point for a hat covers artist like Daniels, who flares up on this matter before heading into the night sharpish, leaving Barry and bassist Paul to fill Charlie in on reality of life with the DTs. As the weeks go by, the DTs settle into a routine of live work, but the matter of original material is clearly festering. At a gig at the low-rent Jacaranda Club, Barry reveals himself to be a relentless philanderer, using gigs as an opportunity to chase skirt while his regular partner Angie is not around. After an unfruitful exchange with the club's manager, Jack braces himself before entering the dressing room, which he's just learned he's going to be sharing with the gargoyle-featured arch-nemesis Stoker. Now, which member of Slade could that be referring to? Yes, noddy. The guitarist with the surrogate Screaming Lord Sutch outfit, Roy Priest and the Undertakers. Part of the Undertakers act features Stoker's appearance from a coffin. Given that on their last encounter the Undertakers had poured a flat pint down the front of Jack's trousers as a prank, once the DTs have played, Jack sneakily padlocks Stoker's coffin shut while he's waiting in the wings, and the DTs then pile into Jack's vintage Chevy and flee into the night, only to find some way down the road that the Undertakers have slashed one of their tyres. So they pull into the services to have the wheel changed, while they head for the caff. However, when a hearse full of vengeful Undertakers pulls in, the DTs sprint for a quick exit, and the perilous high-speed chase ensues, which culminates in Jack colliding with some roadworks and flipping the car. While the rest of the DTs are relatively unscathed, Jack is pinned into the driver's seat and is pulled clear by Stoker, who instructs his bandmates to pile Jack into their coffin before the Chevy goes up in smoke behind them. Both bands awake the following morning in adjacent police cells. Jack is rambling on in a particularly delusional manner, and Stoker wonders aloud how the other DTs ever put up with him and why don't they start their own group. Paul retorts that Stoker's no better off with the third-rate Hammer horror routine. A brief clash of ideologies ensues. Is it all about music or is it all about a good image? It's academic to some extent, as the DTs are stuck playing cover material, and Stoker announces that he's ready to pack it all in any case. At this point, a constable arrives to let them all out except for Jack, adding his own opinion that the DTs ought to get shot of their liability of a frontman. Having given this some thought, the next we see of Barry is him soliciting his brother-in-law Russell whether he'd be interested in roadieing. Russell sees through this in a second. They'd already given him the knockback on the drumming job, and it's obvious they're talking to him now because their main mode of transport is out of commission. However, Russell quickly comes round, and the next we see of him, he's driving the band to a gig in Walsall. The thorny subject of new material raises its head again, and Jack, after vetoing this, announces that Harding, the manager, has arranged some solo cabaret appearances for him, at which news the band vote with their feet, leaving him high and dry when he hits the stage that night. We're whisked away from here to a pub urinal in which a bleary-eyed Stoker is sluicing away a cigarette end with a jet of his piss. Paul appears, and it transpires that he's been seeking Stoker out for a few weeks now. He's persistent about getting Stoker into their band. Stoker informs him the only reason he'd get back into the game would be the prospect of pulling birds. Paul's not too fussed about his motivations though, and browbeats him into attending their following rehearsal session. The following chapter introduces us to the ultra-competitive businessman Robert Seymour, who's busy knocking the pants off an employee at a squash game. Victory in the bag, Seymour guides Tony Devlin to the bar in order to discuss a new business idea, namely an experiment in marketing. Still somewhat enthralled to the Beatles, who he'd first encountered 4 years previously, Seymour's vanity project is to seek out an unknown group and to propel them to the top, employing the same methods that they'd use for any other consumable. Devlin, almost despite himself, becomes enthused with this project and quickly narrows down the most likely area to pin down a potential new pop sensation as the Midlands. Devlin immediately embarks on a trawl of the area's downbeat clubs, becoming increasingly dispirited with the lack of returns, until an unpromising evening in Stourbridge introduces him to iron rod. Devlin is impressed enough to catch a couple of further gigs and to pass on his business card to the nascent quartet. We cut to the bar at one of Iron Rod's gigs, at which a curious Jack is nursing a light ale. Ron Harding and a pair of his goons pop up unexpectedly, and while Jack's manager is suspiciously impervious to the singer's attempt at a career discussion, he's evidently fairly receptive to Iron Rod's performance, in which Stoker proves himself an able, if earthy, frontman. At the end of the performance, however, a war of words swiftly brews up between Stoker and Harding, which leaves the former with a bloody nose and the group unceremoniously sacked from Harding's roster. Barry, however, has kept hold of Devlin's business card, and on the following morning he makes the call, in which he reassures Devlin, not entirely unreasonably, that Iron Rod are no longer caught up in any management contracts. Within days the band are seated in Seymour's plush London office. It's immediately clear that while Seymour and company are enthusiastic on a business level, they have no interest at all in the artistic stakes. It's marketing, packaging and promotion, to which Paul protests, "We're musicians, not a packet of fish fingers." This cuts no ice in the atmosphere of soulless marketing jargon, and Iron Rod are informed that if they want in, they will have to play along with that. The management will be calling the shots in most areas, and the first thing that will have to change is their name. While various band members clearly harbour reservations, they sign on the dotted line. "Sounds better than working for a living," shrugs Charlie. Paul, however, is vocally sceptical about the whole setup, postulating cannily that bands break up less over internal conflicts, but more that they're being shit upon by management to the extent that they can no longer breathe. The next chapter sees their overnight transformation into Flame, freshly set up with sparkling new equipment, press representation and a radical image change into the bargain. Our boy's trajectory to the top is underway, starting off with a highly embarrassing photo shoot. With this in the bag, we see Russell whisking the band away to their first recording session in his new van, Charlie wondering aloud whether, unlike the Monkees, they will actually be allowed to play on their own session. As it turns out, the session goes reasonably well. Publicist Summers turns up to inform them that their next publicity jaunt, a little boat trip, is already lined up. We jump from here to Radio Phoenix, a somewhat embattled pirate station set on the old MOD fort on Red Sands, which is off the Kent coast. Flame have endured choppy waters and seasickness in order to publicise their new single there. As the still queasy band members settle down for an on-air interview, an emissary of one of the station's rivals, the 20-stone ex-pro wrestler Billy Shakespeare, and his assorted heavies begin to attack the station with machine gun fire. Thankfully, the proprietorial MOD, in the form of a helicopter full of Marines, step in the nick of time, heading off Shakespeare's boarding party and whisking Flame and assorted station crew to safety. Once landed safely, the band are whisked off to Seymour's Colchester pad, and while Stoker is less than enthused over their recent tribulations, the further publicity that this incident has generated appears to be the cause of much celebration for their management team. By contrast, Barry doesn't have any problem with this level of managerial exploitation, and on these lines we can already see a potential rift forming within the band's ranks. A phony 21st birthday bash for Barry is arranged at Wolverhampton City Hall to double as a celebration for the band's single going top 10. The event is a slightly uneasy mix of family, friends and industry types. Significantly, both Jack Daniels and Harding are in attendance, the latter wasting little time in collaring Seymour and letting him know that Flame is still technically under contract to him. Seymour agrees to meet him the following week to discuss the matter, before quizzing Devlin on this. Devlin realises that, although he'd been assured the band had no outstanding contractual obligations, this shady character must be the DT's old agent. Jack is called over and he confirms that Harding has probably covered himself here. However, seeing the chance to get the boys out of a spot and to earn himself some quick money on the side, Jack offers to extract the only copy of that contract from Harding's office in return for £500 cash. True to his word, Daniels some days later places this document in Devlin's hands and pockets a bulging envelope in return. When Seymour and Harding's meeting takes place the following week, Seymour plays all cooperative and then, almost casually, requests a copy of the DT's contract, which Harding's visibly flummoxed secretary then fails to locate. "No hurry, drop it in the post," advises Seymour cheerily on exiting the building, before a furious Harding plays merry hell with the unfortunate secretary, who then recalls that Jack had breezed into the office the previous Friday while Harding had been out at lunch. We cut to Jack, who's now trawling the country in his van, reflecting sadly on the non-realisation of his solo success. A washed-up old hack Jack Daniels may be, but hardship and bitter disappointment could not strip Jack Daniels of his humanity. He still considers Flame his boys and genuinely does wish them well. Cruising the highways in his dormobile, Jack visits old haunts and entertains himself with a string of casual hookups, the latest of which takes place, unwisely, back in the Midlands. Just as Jack is taking some naughty Polaroids of his latest conquest in the back of the van, the door is suddenly yanked open to reveal 3 of Harding's goons, Ron, Terry and Tubby, all of whom positively ooze malevolent fake chumminess. Terry propels the naked Daniels out to the front of the van, where he's strapped to the radiator, and in a scene which leaves a deep impression on most readers, your mind's eye will never unsee this once you've read it, proceeds to worry Jack in the most disturbing fashion with a tire iron. It's a brutally unpleasant scene. Mercifully, we're transported from this unsettling scene to the studio, where Flame is showing distinct symptoms of not getting it together. Amid the general disharmony, Rhodey Russell is sent out, gopher fashion, on a refreshment run, but returns instead with a selection of Polaroids of the badly mauled Jack Daniels, which have been placed in his hands by Harding's thugs, along with a verbal warning for the management. Seymour coldly informs Russell that the band do not need to know about this, before, even more coldly, advising the roadie that his services will no longer be required. The crestfallen Russell accepts a handful of fivers from the slimebag Seymour, and the next day he pays Jack, who's now in hospital with his jaw wired up, a visit. Harding, however, has beaten him to it, leaving Daniels with a bowl of grapes and the promise that he'll never work in the Midlands again. It's a depressing spectacle. Jack's convalescence is gradual, and he spends much of his downtime reflecting on past glories and following Flame's now distant progress through the Inkies, as if he's living it out vicariously through them. But he does genuinely care about the lads and is concerned for their welfare. Since their first album, Flame have graduated to the larger venues, and we now see them in packed 2,000-seaters, where we're told twitching thighs have left some of the seats wet. The hysterical crowd are screeching for a further encore, and the situation is threatening to get out of hand. Backstage, a bitter row breaks out amongst the band members before they're forced to clear the venue and run the gauntlet of marauding teeny boppers outside to their lipstick-daubed Daimler. Stoker's so jaded he starts goading the chauffeur into trying to knock down a couple of fans as they make their getaway. There's a further scene at the hotel when they realise they're too late for anything from the kitchen, and when an irate porter tries to prevent the band from taking any girls up to the rooms, he gets a punch in the face from Barry for his troubles. Devlin has to bribe the man into not taking the matter any further, and they head off the following morning for Newcastle. Checking into their hotel, Stoker launches into Barry about the offhand way in which he treats his partner Angie. "Do you fancy shagging it yourself or something? You can if you like, as far as I'm concerned. Do you know, Barry, I can't believe you really are a bigger cunt as you make yourself out to be." Devlin and Seymour, meanwhile, are engaged in a business tete-a-tete, in which Seymour makes it plain that his backers are getting cold feet about the whole enterprise, and he's getting pressurised to pull out. At a meeting with the band later that evening, the manager is haughtily dismissive of Paul's concerns about the flimsiness of their image, at which the bassist is becoming increasingly embarrassed. Paul storms out of the meeting. There's some further discussion about whether or not the band can follow the Beatles' trajectory, in which the various members' deep-seated differences become even more evident. Seymour, for his part, counters the artistic discussion with hard-nosed marketing talk. The tour carries on with various other incidents of rock and roll lunacy. Back in London, meanwhile, Seymour is again visited by Harding, which proves a reliably unpleasant experience. He's then called by another of his backers, who informs him he's just been gifted a football sock filled with human shit in the glove box of his car, and has immediately associated the incident with this disreputable pop group that Seymour is involved with. Seymour manages to cut this awkward line in conversation short, and in spite of his revulsion, he was fascinated by the image of Harding actually filling the sock. The tour presses ahead meanwhile, the band's ostensible success and popularity barely masking their increasing dissatisfaction and internal tensions. The final night is in Southampton, and before they even hit the stage, there's been crowd hysteria and fainting. To Barry's further consternation, Angie has decided to show up for the event. Stoker leads the band out on stage and manages to talk the audience down from riot mode before the band turn in a wall-shaking performance. As the set nears its climax, Paul unexpectedly throws in an unscripted bass solo, an inspired piece of improvisation for which Charlie joins in. Paul knew then that at that moment he was the best bass player in the world. While the audience evidently appreciate this, Stoker doesn't. "Oi, goalie, get back in goal!" Seymour, along with his wife and daughter, greet the band back at the hotel before cutting out on the after-show party, for which Angie shows up and browbeats a booze-hungry Stoker into having a dance with her. However, she's concerned for Paul, who's evidently been sent to Coventry, I don't know if that works if you're from the Midlands, but anyway, by Stoker and Barry, and goes to check up on him. By the time she comes down with the news that Paul has announced he's quitting the band, Stoker is some way into the Scotch and Cokes, and staggering up to the room to try and talk Paul out of this, drunkenly puts his fist through the mirror and is promptly whisked off to A&E. Seymour, meanwhile, returns home to find that nameless parties, undoubtedly connected with Harding, have performed a Godfather job on his kids' dolls. Back at the hotel, Stoker returns, one hand in bandages, the other clasping Angie's. The question to Barry's whereabouts, probably in a room with some groupies, hanging in the air, rather awkwardly, before the inevitable plays out between Angie and Stoker, who's apparently unhampered by his damaged hand, commenting as she slips between his bed sheets, "Good grief, Barry must be balmy!" Tucking into a hotel breakfast the following morning, Stoker is confronted by a smug-faced Harding, who informs him that Flame are now officially back on his roster, holding out the elusive contract. Stoker, bluntly taking the wind out of his sails, informs him that there is no longer a Flame to manage. Back home with his wife, Paul is paid an unexpected visit from Jack, who, on his own in the lounge for a few moments, takes in the trappings of Paul's success, momentarily letting his own rock and roll dreams once again play out internally. But he's brought swiftly down to earth when Paul informs him that the group is over. Jack can't begin to process this. "You must be mad. Flame's made you a star. Look what it's given you." Clearly, Paul and Jack's realities will never intersect. What's Paul going to do now? "What I always did, play riffs." And Jack, he's moving to Liverpool to start something up in the clubs with an old mate, of course. Paul shook his head and felt his heart swell. "You're a fucking incurable, Jack. Do you know that? One of these days somebody's going to write the true story of rock and roll, and it's not going to be about Elvis Presley or the Beatles or anyone else like that. It'll be about some bloody nutter like you who sacrificed his life for it. You know what you are, Jack? You're a right rock and roll bastard." Jack Daniels cried openly, feeling no shame. John Pidgeon's background as a music journalist clearly enabled him to flesh out the more basic plot of the film script, adding a further level of gritty authenticity to the group's struggles with and for fame, and adding a deeper dimension to the respective characters involved. While the film pulled few punches and refused to pander to the demands of a teeny bopper fan base, Pidgeon's book definitely kicked this up a few notches. The more unsavoury aspects of the plot reportedly getting the book withdrawn for sale at certain venues at which the film was playing. Of course, it's impossible not to read this without picturing the various members of Slade in their bespoke roles, effectively exaggerated fictional representations of themselves. The story was intended to reflect the band's experiences while falling shy of being autobiographical. Jack Daniels, for instance, could be said to loosely parallel the real-life Johnny Howells, who fronted the In-Betweens in the 1960s before the band's four instrumentalists decided to break away from their frontman and to go it alone as Ambrose Slade. Pidgeon succeeds, perhaps even further than the film did, in depicting the grime behind the glamour, the self-deception, the disillusionment, the cynicism and the sleaze beneath pop's shiny veneer. Is one area, perhaps, in which the film does have the edge over the book, which is in its depiction of the smoky, brick-terraced industrial Midlands of the period, which is hammered home in its images of steel plants, disused canals, council homes and pigeon lofts. It's an element which Pidgeon's book perhaps slightly neglects, but for all that, the book is a very respectable novelisation of a film which, despite its troubled initial reception, it never did turn them into the Beatles, can be seen in retrospect as one of the more worthwhile examples of rock and roll cinema, and a very creditable feature in the career of one of the country's finest rock bands. So thanks once again for joining me here at Bert's Books. If you've been enjoying these, then feel free to hit those buttons and all these things. For my next review, possibly we're going to be looking at the 1982 novel of psychological terror by Andrew Neiderman, Pin. Do join me again. All right!